as we come to our studies in this very large book of Hebrews, where the superiority, the supremacy of Christ is the main theme that runs from chapter 1 right through to the end of the book, we are first of all introduced to God. We're introduced to God and his communication. And so he begins the book by saying that God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets. So he's referring to the Old Testament that we have, and in particular God's methods and timing of communication that we have in our Old Testament Bible. Now, it may be a kind of obvious point, but it's important, I think, to notice right at the beginning that God chose to communicate in language. Now, that seems self-evident, but he didn't communicate to us in any other method. So it's not pictures, it's words, sentences, it's language. And God spoke, and we're going to think about how he did that in the Old Testament here right at the beginning of the book of Hebrews. Now here the word various occurs twice. So God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets. This word various would remind us that there was no single communication by God, or even singular communication in Old Testament times. He spoke at various times and in various ways. So when you go into the Old Testament is characterised by the variety of God's communication to his people. Now we see two ways that this variety is described. First of all, times, and secondly, ways. So that God's revelation, and I'll put the words up at the top here, was progressive. It was incremental. It was also partial. And we see that, for example, when God spoke in the book of Genesis, then he didn't reveal all of his Old Testament revelation. And even if you went to the book of Exodus, he is speaking again and right through until you get to Malachi. You need to read from Genesis through to Malachi to get the fullness of what God had to say to his Old Testament people. It was revealed at different times. In fact, that Old Testament revelation took place over hundreds and hundreds of years. Small revelation after small revelation, progressive, incremental, building on the previous revelation, and each time partial, not the whole story. So there was various times, but also various ways. So different methods used, for example, and again I'll put some words up here. So you had God speaking in dreams and visions. You had God also writing on walls, on tablets. You even had him speaking through a donkey. Different methods. And that's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. And so God spoke at various times in various ways. There was a variety of revelation. Now it's important to note that he's not speaking about the present time, not even when he was writing in that early New Testament time. He's referring back to what took place before the Lord Jesus Christ came, and that becomes evident as you work your way down through these verses, and in particular in verse 1 down to verse 3, you discover that. So God is speaking, and in fact God has spoken in this manner. That word spoke is actually in the aorist Greek tense. So this is something that happened in a point, and he spoke in this way in the Old Testament context in time past. He no longer speaks in this way, and he spoke specifically to the fathers and did so by the prophets. So yes, different methods, absolutely. Yes, different times, different methods, different times, but consistently this was true. It was to the prophets, it was by the prophets, and it was to the fathers. Now, who are the fathers? Well, the people who are receiving this obviously had a Jewish background. There is so much assumed within this epistle in terms of Old Testament truth in relation to the Old Covenant, in relation to the tabernacle and temple, in relation to the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, and that knowledge is assumed. People with a Jewish background. Also, it's evident that people who were going back to these Jewish things. So that would be the main character or the main group of people who were receiving this. So as he writes to this group of people, he reminds them of the way that God spoke to those people, Israel, in the past, the methods that he employed, the partial, progressive, incremental revelation that he employed. The dreams, the vision, the writing on the walls, the tablets, the speaking through a donkey, the raising up of prophets who were able to say, "Thus saith the Lord," and so forth. And these prophets spoke to the fathers. And the fathers would be Israel in Old Testament times. They were the recipients of divine revelation and were privileged to a great extent by that. And in fact, Paul holds his own people to account as being privileged in that way when he writes to the Romans about the gospel. So when we start out in this book of Hebrews, we are starting out with God and God's communication in the Old Testament. Now he sets the tone of the book by doing this because he's now going to contrast with the situation in Old Testament times. He's going to contrast that with now what God has done in his Son, the Lord Jesus, and demonstrate that the Lord Jesus Christ is God's full and final revelation, and as such is superior to that Old Testament revelation, and therefore he's going to present the superiorities of Christ in so many ways, actually, in his suffering and in his sacrifice and his person. And here it is in terms of God's revelation in his Son. So we're starting out here in Hebrews chapter 1. This is just the first statement that we're going to have a wee look at, that we've had a little look at, I should say. And we're going to move on from here and see the superiority of Christ in our studies.